Okay, so we're going to look at Hume's arguments or criticisms. So those are arguments against the design argument for the existence of God. We're going to start just by doing a quick recap of the main points of the arguments themselves. Remember, there are two kind of central thinkers here. One is Aquinas over here. Now, Aquinas, he argues by analogy. He says, look, an arrow, like this one, is unintelligent. So if it moved towards its mark, you would expect some sort of archer to move it towards the mark. In other words, a purpose and unintelligence means there must be some sort of design, and of course the universe itself is full of purpose, he thinks, and therefore also designed. The other one we've examined is William Paley, and Paley argues with another analogy. He says a watch, for instance, has complex parts that move together for a purpose. And so do biological things. So if we think that the watch is designed because it has complex parts that move together for a purpose, well then also so do biological things. And so both of them conclude that the Christian God must be the one who caused either the universe for Aquinas or biology for Paley to come into existence. So what are Hume's main points? Well, Hume basically says that the argument is so flawed, it fails, he thinks, to make the link between these analogies and these examples. I'm going to write just fails to make the link because in a lot of ways it fails to make the link, not just in some ways. For Hume, this link, it could be between kind of the analogy and the application, so the universe, or indeed the conclusion that God exists. So Hume really has two kind of strands of criticism. One is that the argument itself does not work. And he has two reasons we're going to look at for that conclusion. But also he thinks that this bit here, the conclusion that God must be the cause if the argument did work, is also problematic. So Hume wrote his criticisms primarily in his book Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion. Now, it's important to note that actually, because they are dialogues, he has several characters, Cleanthes, Philo, and Demea, arguing about the existence of God through philosophy of religion. Now, when we're talking about what Hume thinks, in these examples, it's primarily Philo who is speaking with the voice of Hume. But I'm going to take the dialogue out of the equation, if that makes sense. I'm just going to present them as Hume's criticisms. So the first criticism is a disanalogy. He accuses Aquinas, Paley, by the way, was writing after Hume. But he accuses Aquinas and also the kind of examples that he's used that look a bit like Aquinas and frankly a bit like Paley's too, even though he was writing beforehand, of a disanalogy. A disanalogy is when an analogy doesn't work. So when two things can't actually compare with each other. Hume argues, and I'm putting this in red, by the way, because these are criticisms of the design argument. Hume argues that there is two bigger difference between man-made things. Notice here that the arrow and the target, or even the watch, are man-made. One of the examples that Cleanthes uses, who is the person who kind of argued for this in his dialogues, is a house. Right? There's too big a difference between kind of on the one side these kind of man-made things, which is where we get the kind of test for design, be that just unintelligent and with a telos, or complex parts with a telos. There's a big difference between the man-made things on one side and on the other side kind of natural things. And if this difference is huge enough, and especially when, say, Aquinas is comparing kind of the universe to an arrow, it's pretty big, then this kind of connection, this analogy between the two, does not work. As Hume himself puts it, the dissimilitude, so that's difference, the dissimilitude is so striking that the utmost you can here pretend to is a guess. In other words, you can't draw the conclusion that because these sorts of things are designed, that therefore these sorts of things are designed. The test just doesn't transfer, says Hume. Now, Hume has a separate criticism, another criticism of the arguments. And this is the fallacy of composition. Now, this criticism applies best by far to Aquinas, doesn't really apply to Paley, but remember, Hume was writing before Paley. The fallacy of composition is this mistake in reasoning. You say, you know, let's start with this box here. Each member of a group has kind of property X, okay? So you might say each member of your family was given birth to, okay? That's property X in that case. And then you might draw the conclusion incorrectly, because this is a fallacy, a mistaken reasoning, that the group itself has property X. Okay. Now that is an error. Why? Well, let's just finish our example that we've just used there. If each member of your family was given birth to, then your family was given birth to? That doesn't make any sense. Just because each member of a group has a particular quality, it doesn't mean that the group itself has that quality. Well, how does Hume apply this to the design argument? Remember, Aquinas says that kind of each thing has a telos in the world. I'm going to put telos in this colour as well. Telos, remember, is purpose. And then concludes from this that, well, of course, then the universe has a telos. Well, that's the same error as this, right? That is, as Hume would say, the fallacy of composition happens here, reasoning from this to this. That is the fallacy of composition. Hume says, because he is an empiricist, that he can't really think of the universe as a thing, because that's not how it works. You don't see the universe, you see bits of it. So Hume says these are two big problems, both of which show us that you can't draw the conclusion that the universe or parts of it are designed, partly because there is a disanalogy between the examples given and the real things in the world, and partly because especially Aquinas commits the fallacy of composition. But let's say you manage to overcome these objections, okay? And there are definitely attempts to overcome these objections. Let's say you manage it. Well, Hume says, doesn't matter. It's still, all you've got is this bit here, okay? What you haven't got is this bit, because even if you can establish that the universe is designed or biology is designed, you can't establish that kind of the Christian God is responsible for it. In fact, he thinks that the design arguments are fundamentally irreligious, right? They produce an answer, what caused the universe? Well, he thinks they would actually produce a kind of what he would call an anthropomorphized God, which is seeing something as human, right? Seeing a non-human, in this case God, as human, which is not what the design argument wants to say. It wants to conclude that the Christian God exists, this all-powerful, eternal, all-knowing being. Well, Hume says, look, let's ignore this, shall we? Let's suppose that the analogy works. So, wrong colour, apologies. Suppose the analogy works. Okay, and that it isn't a disanalogy. Well, then you've got to take, he says, the whole analogy. What does he mean by that? Well, let's find out. You take the whole analogy. You can't just say, well, it's like, these designed things, therefore it is designed, but also, he says, you've got to take the nature of the designer. Now, if we think about, for a second, kind of the nature of designers of, I just put that in big colour for unknown reasons. If you think about the nature of the designer of, say, a watch, well, it's actually quite a complex thing. But remember earlier, the example that Hume focuses on at various points is a house. So let's take the example of the house, right? So a house, well, what's that built by? Is that built by one omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent being? No, right? It's built by a group of builders. That group of builders is flawed. They make mistakes. They're male, they're female, they're young, they're old, they're mortal, right? And if you're saying that this analogy does work, then you've got to take not just the claim that the thing is designed, but also that the designer must be in some way similar to the thing that you're comparing it to. So when, like Aquinas, you say, oh, the universe is designed, Hume says, well, then you would have to accept also the conclusion from that. And the conclusion would not be this monotheistic God, right? This one God with all of those divine characteristics. It would be, just like the builders, a whole load of gods who are flawed and mortal and operate in teamwork and are young and old, male and female. As the commentator David O'Connor puts it, he says that Hume notes, okay, so it's probably worth putting this at the top. What he's saying is Hume notes that the design argument anthropomorphically, so reducing there, reduces the concept of divine nature, so that's the perfect God that Aquinas and Paley believed in, to that of human nature. If the design argument works, it doesn't establish a Christian God, but rather something a bit more like this. But of course, Hume thinks it doesn't work. He thinks it does actually commit a disanalogy and the fallacy of composition.